Welcome back, everyone. And before I dive into the agenda, I have a very interesting question for all of you. Who all have seen this amazing thriller movie called Eagle Eye? Feel free to raise your hand. Wow, that's really good. Anyone? Okay, so there is some entertainment goals for you, not just learning goals. Feel free to watch out this movie. This movie has got an amazing character called Aria that's going to blow your mind. And you're going to relate to this topic a lot more once you watch out this movie. With that, let's get started. So, critical infrastructure. We all understand that millions of Australians rely on critical infrastructure for essential services like telecommunication, transport, health services. And imagine once these services are not available, it's going to have a huge impact on everybody's life. And that's where it is very much imperative for all of us to secure and build resilience around it. Bit about myself. I am Senior Security Advisor working with Nokia and have 16 plus years of dedicated cyber experience into both OT and IT sides of the world. Some credentials into cyber as well. I am part of Maitre Attack Community Advisory Board and actively work with critical infrastructure entities to mitigate cybersecurity risk for them. Now, agenda for today is pretty straightforward. We'll look into why air gap is not enough, cyber strategies for critical infrastructure. I'll talk about the 5 core building blocks, which are must for any cyber strategies that critical infrastructure entities needs to adopt. And then I'm here to share some of the real-life case studies around 2 critical infrastructure entities so that you can yourself imagine and understand that what went through these, what were the problem areas, what were the challenges, and how we helped them to solve these real-life challenges. And then to summarize, I'll share some key takeaways. Now, it is important to understand that critical infrastructure is underpinned by industrial control systems, something that was very well covered by Sanam and Scott in a very fantastic presentation. These industrial control systems, which includes your HMI, SCADA, PLCs, RTUs, and many complex devices. These devices traditionally have been air-gapped. And there was a specific reason that, why they were air-gapped. So that any threat that slips into the IT environment do not spread across to these OT systems, which runs mission-critical applications. And therefore, this was the reason, which was felt to keep these systems isolated. Well, the life is not like that. The thing is, in today's reality world, air gap is dead. We see more and more convergence happening from IT and the OT side of the world. And there are some challenges that I'm quickly going to talk about, that what we see nowadays is the disappearing perimeters and expanding threat landscape. Now, the idea of having a perfect perimeter security devices and all the application, I'm sure that idea is totally obsolete and it will resonate with all of you. Now, employees want to access the application from anywhere, from any device, and at their feasibility. And that leads to an attacking threat landscape. Second point is around, I would say, increasing threat complexity, and this is something which is more and more increasing nowadays. A week back, CISA and FBI, they shared a threat advisory talking about a Snatch ransomware variant, which is specifically targeting critical infrastructure. Third, new business models and ecosystem. Now, every critical infrastructure entity, if you see, it is very complex in itself. If I talk about telecommunication infrastructure, if you look at how the 5G model and the 6G network architecture is spread across, it is highly complex. It talks about multiple components from EPC, OSS, radio access network, how they are interlinked. It's a challenging task. Unless until you understand how these core network elements work together, you cannot think of securing them. Fourth, I would say, is something that I already talked about, is around more and more fusion, which is happening. With the Industry 4.0 revolution, what we see is that it offers, more and more efficiency and expanded capability, and everyone wants to embrace this fusion. Fifth, skill set shortages. I think everyone already spoken about it during earlier today, that it's a real challenge in the industry. And we all know cybersecurity systems are as good as the people that operate them. And with the rapidly evolving ecosystem, it is very hard to find right experts, especially after knowing that even the key systems are also evolving. Sixth, I think we already spoke about this during earlier presentation. The cybersecurity regulations, specifically around critical infrastructure, the SOCI Act, it is getting more and more stringent. Idea of reporting your critical asset information, reporting critical incident, having a critical risk infrastructure risk management program is something which is a need of an hour for every critical infrastructure entities. And not just that, if you look at every critical infrastructure entity, for railways, for railway transport, in addition to SOCI Act, they also have to look into the rail cybersecurity regulations like AS 7770. For telecom sector, it is telecom sector security reform. So there are multiple security regulations, guidelines, and the best practices, essential aid, NIST recommendations, which makes it more and more overwhelming and complex for an entity to follow and adhere. Now, with all these cyber incidents which are evolving, I think one thing which is pretty clear with all of you is, I think it will resonate with all of you, isn't it? So the point here is, and this is one part that I do with as part of my critical advisory services with most of my clients is, to share this enablement and learning with all of them, is that they are going to be a target. They are going to be compromised. It's just a matter of time. If not today, it's gonna be tomorrow. If not tomorrow, it's gonna be next month, next year, but it's coming. So what do we need to do? We gotta have an incident response plan in place, bare minimum, to make sure that we know what we need to do when something bad happens in our environment. With that, let's talk about some of the critical basic building blocks, or I would say the foundational building blocks for any cyber strategies that have to be in place for any critical infrastructure entities. So these are some of, I would say, the 5 basic building blocks, and these are must to have in order to achieve an effective outcome. First and foremost, for any critical infrastructure entity is to have a unified visibility. It is imperative to understand that you can't control what you can't see. So that is where I think having a clear asset inventory of having OT as well as IT asset in your environment is imperative. Second, I think is very, very critical that we gotta have a continuous risk assessment program in place. Of a lot of activity that I do with my clients, I make them aware that why this multi-stage risk assessment is very much critical in your environment, so that you know that what are the threats, what are the risks, what are the vulnerabilities that exist in your environment, how you can mitigate them, what is the risk rating, is this something which is acceptable to the asset owners and the operators that exist in your environment? If not, what is the risk treatment plan that has to be put in place to make sure that risk is acceptable to a level which is acceptable to the boards and the CISOs. Third, I think is very, very critical again from a system hygiene point of view. And this is something which has been highlighted by Gartner also, that misconfigurations into network elements is one of the biggest causes of cyber breach. And that is why it is very, very important to make sure that you harden these systems. Systems which are specifically 20 to 50 years old. I'm specifically talking around here, assets within the OT environment. These systems are like, built for legacy sort of systems. So this is something which is very, very, I would say, the core pillar that we really have to keep in mind from a unified visibility perspective. Second core pillar, and the second element that has to be part of the cyber strategy is building a cyber security management plan. Now, if you walk into any critical infrastructure entities, and this is part of my many discussions that I do with the CISOs, and if I talk about that, okay, show me, something, some sort of a guiding document that you follow, and it's all fragmented. There's nothing. So this is, I think, one piece of document that we have to have in place to make sure that I need to understand that, what are the methodology, what is the process that you need to follow in your environment. Rail environment will be different, telecom environment will be different, health environment will be different, and each environment has got its own unique challenges. What are the processes that you need to follow? You may be following some essential aid, you may be following some ISMs in place and some NIST standards in place, but you gotta document that, okay, this is a sort of a Bible for me that I need to document and follow across my environment. So this is the first step that needs to be documented for any environment. Second, I think it is very, again, important that we have to have a defined security policy in place with some of the critical security processes like change management, patch management, vulnerability management, incident detection and response process, supply chain security, backup processes. These are some of the baseline security processes that have to be in place. Third, and I would say this is one of the foremost pillar that have to have in place, is something around end-to-end security architecture, because resiliency of critical infrastructure can be ensured once you have a dedicated, or I would say a blueprinted security architecture, which clearly should define that, what is the communication metrics, what are the internal, external interfaces, what is the security policy, access policies which are defined across the multiple network elements which are zoned across the access policies and the access rights that you have defined in the network architecture. Now, this is very, very important, along with some of the baseline security controls like your firewall, next generation IPS, then your identity and access control, along, I would say, with the threat intel, and all these components, if you see down below, each one of these elements is talking to a centralized SIM. That's where, all your automation and orchestration is gonna happen. Now, since we are talking about IT and OT security, I want to specify here specifically that it is very important to keep track, monitor, and have a special control at the intersection of where all your IT and OT system merge. Because this is one of the very sensitive area where any threat that slips into the IT environment can penetrate to your OT environment. And this is where, specifically from a best practices standpoint, what we normally share with our clients is, you gotta have 2 jump host servers to make sure that they are placed, one outside the OT environment within the DMZ, and one within the OT environment. And any remote access that has to happen from IT environment to the OT environment has to cross these 2 different jump host servers. So for any remote access that has to happen from the IT environment to the OT environment has to have 2 unique accounts, 2 strong passphrases, and 2 MFA tokens. Imagine how difficult this is for the attacker, to penetrate. I'm not saying it's impossible. It is possible. But for security, it is all about defense in depth and following those secure design principles, which is all about least privilege, MFA, network segmentation, access control on a need-to-know basis. So this is, I would say, a baseline of end-to-end security architecture that has to be framed. Fourth, I would say, fourth pillar is around cybersecurity testing. Although this is not very successful in an OT environment, because we understand that OT environment availability is a very important factor. We cannot just go for a downtime and have our patching cycles and vulnerability getting mitigated. So what do we do in those kind of a scenario? We have to make sure that we gotta have some sort of a compensating controls in place to make sure that those vulnerabilities which are not getting patched in an OT environment specifically, those are getting exploited. The fifth pillar is around cyber education, and this is very critical. We all understand that humans are the first line of defense when it comes to critical infrastructure attacks. So what is needed? What is needed is an ongoing program where we upskill our employees, upskills all the teams, not just the IT teams, but also we make sure that the operators, the network asset owners, the safety team, the operations teams, the maintenance team, they are all part of this exercise, the cyber awareness exercise. We gotta have these incident response plan in place, and we need to make sure that we run these tabletop exercises, something which was, I think, shared by Scott as well in the previous presentation, that how critical are these exercises, so that in a crisis scenario, we are well aware what needs to be done, what role do we need to play. And definitely, no exercise is perfectly, I would say, perfect. There will be some lesson learned, but at least we'll be in a position to make these learnings as a part of a feedback, and we strengthen our plans going forward. So these are, I would say, some of the 5 core basic building blocks that has to be adhered as part of cyber strategy for any critical infrastructure. And as you see, these are all not, I would say, the siloed components. Ultimately, they have to stitch to your centralized SOC. That is where the automation and orchestration is happening. That's where the automation is happening. And that's where you integrate it with your threat intel that can come from multiple third-party sources to make sure that it's an end-to-end process. Now, while we have made sure that cyber breaches are inevitable, and how do we make sure that how we are implementing it in our environment? Now, to cover it up, what I have done today and what I'm going to share with all of you are the 2 real-life case studies from critical infrastructure sector. First one being from the telecom sector. And before I share this with you, I'm going to share a real-life story around this telecom infrastructure. The story is that this telecom operator was hit with a cyber attack around a year ago, and they lost the critical PII data of close to 300K subscribers. They also suffered a lot of network outage because of multiple DDoS attack in their network. This was really a hard time for this telecom operator that eventually led to the CEO of this telecom operator bow down in apology in a public conference. This was a rare to see movement, but it happened. Entire, I would say, everyone in the universe was behind the telecom operator, including the government, the regulatory bodies, I would say, the privacy and the legal entities, making sure that, that they have not performed the duty of care when it comes to building and securing the resilience around the telecom infrastructure. Now, definitely, there were many blind spots in the security architecture while there were many security controls as part of the telecom security architecture, including your firewall, IPS, anti-malware. What was missing is, the right level of configuration and the security access policies across these network elements. A real, I would say, at this point of time, what was needed is a clear action plan along with, a resolution that what are the blind spots and how this can be mitigated by the telco security experts. And this is when we came into the picture, and what we performed for them was a telco-based security assessment using NIST CSF framework. Now, for any of you, you might be aware that NIST CSF framework is a pretty extensive framework, which is based on these 5 core functions and which cut across the 108 subcategories. And this is where really helped the telecom operator to understand and build what is the current profile for them, that where are they lagging in terms of what are the security holes when it comes to the identity functions, when it comes to the detect and the protect functions. As part of the assessment, what we realized were there were close to 56 critical findings, as basic as that there were not proper access control policies in place. As part of one of the 3GPP recommendations that we follow in the 5G architecture is that there has to be a trusted communication between network element that has to be secured using TLS and certificate-based mutual authentication. That was missing here. So similar to like this, there were many controls that were identified as part of this assessment. And what we build, it is not just highlighting the gap. It is really important for an operator to understand that where do I move from here? So as part of this assessment, what we built for them was a target profile. So for them to understand, this is the optimized state for me. And how do I move from them? That's where we build a resolution plan for them, laying out that how they need to fix these gaps and how they really need to move from their current state to their target state. So the outcome was, I would say, an end-to-end security plan, giving them a complete visibility in terms of the gap and in terms of a complete next steps that how do they need to proceed further. Moving to the next case study, and this is something which is pretty interesting. This comes from a public transport rail metro sector. And before I talk about this, there is something that I want to share with you. Have you ever thought of taking a rail metro ride, which is fully automated, driverless, most modernized? Believe me, my kid's gonna love this idea. Well, that dream is not far away. April 2023, this year, Sydney Metro tested its first driverless rail metro ride that crossed Sydney Harbour underwater without any real passengers, but rather carrying canisters of water in the rail metro just to simulate the weight. Of course, we understand due to the safety concern, this was not the real passengers next time, but we all understand that they are working towards to make this dream come true by next year. Now, what I'm going to talk about is not, I would say, a project like that, but a similar project which has got advanced use cases of a rail metro project with automatic train control, driver-assisted video systems, onboard CCTV, condition monitoring. So all these advanced use cases, something that were made possible in this public rail metro transport project, which actually how it started was that it has got its communication system, which was running on an analog-based radio system, and that got replaced with the digital modern radio communication system, which is based on a private LTE technology. Now, this private LTE network is gonna support some of the mission critical application for this rail customer, which is gonna have multiple components, subsystems in place, which includes your OSS components, which includes your radio access network, which includes your EPC network, which includes cyber as a subsystem, which includes your I would say, your handheld devices. So it is a combination of a highly complex subsystems with the heterogeneity of multiple third-party components. Now, the challenge here was to understand that what are the risks that lie in a rail-specific sector, because as I said, every environment is very, very different from its risk perspective, from the threat perspective. So for us, the challenge here was to understand what are the risks from a rail context, and then clearly perform a multi-stage risk assessment. So what we delivered was in the two phases. What we conducted was a preliminary and a detailed risk assessment for the customer that really helped them understand that what are the risks, how do I need to take care of them, what are the critical assets in my environment, if these assets get compromised, what's going to be the impact in my environment. And then not just giving the risk portion, but also coming to the design part of it. If you remember the third pillar that I spoke about in the end-to-end approach, end-to-end security architecture. So what we carved out for this rail metro transport entity was a transport security blueprint that gave them a clear visibility that how these different assets that exist in their architecture will get segregated into separate zones, into separate conduits, what's going to be the policy, how they're going to integrate with a centralized SOC, which is already integrated with their IT SOC. So this is something which is articulated to give them a complete end-to-end visibility. And then architecture is not enough, believe me. Sometimes you really have to document things. And that is where what we created for them is a HLD and LLD, which clearly gives them the visibility that how these network elements are going to communicate with each other. What's going to be the communication metrics. So this is where we provide them end-to-end security framework. Now, towards the end, I would like to summarize with some few key takeaways. And this is something as part of my role. I have been asked by most of the CISOs that, okay, we have got something, we have got IT, we have some OT, but where do we start? What are the first few steps that we need to take? And as I started with my core pillar, first was getting that visibility. And this is which is very, very important. You have to have a start with a maturity assessment in your organization. And for ICS environment, IEC 62443 is the baseline standard. And this is what you really need to get into. You have to perform this assessment to get a real picture of where do you lie in your current transformation journey. Second and foremost is around securing the architecture and process. Just like you treat your IT security, it is time now really to document and blueprint your OT security architecture as well. And understand the core principles. There are a lot of similarities between IT and OT side also. From a process standpoint, we have to make sure that the OT teams are also well aware and they are also part of following these security process. Third, identity and access management. I think we can't stress it anymore. We know that this credential abuse are most popular way of getting into your network environment. So this has to be in place from day one. Fourth, as I already spoke about, misconfigurations. This is something you have to make sure that, as much as possible, that hardening continuous security audit, specifically across your OT environment, is a must. Fifth, real-time threat detection and response. We cannot have a siloed approach. We all have to understand this. We have to make sure that just like your OT security, once it is matured in a particular sense, it has to integrate with a common SOC. A SOC which is already integrating your IT component. And that is where we need to define playbooks for your OT subsystems as well. We have to integrate it with your SIM, SOAR systems which are already on their way, and then have to integrate with your threat intel, which can come from multiple sources as well. So towards the end, I would just like to summarize and say that it takes a collaborative effort from both IT team as well as OT team to secure and build a resilience around critical infrastructure. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions in the room? Oh, one over here. Fantastic.
Nice presentation.
Thank you.
A lot of talks about the OT and the critical infrastructure. So I love it because I come from that background and I love what I do. So as you have showed two case studies, one of the case studies was in the rail network, which you guys did a risk assessment.
Right.
So I would like to know that once you have done the risk assessment, you might have submitted a report, there may be critical top-down risk. Then what happened after that? That is a question.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. That's a great question. So for this rail metro project, actually, we conducted this risk assessment in multi-stage, preliminary risk assessment when it was conducted. The outcome of this risk assessment was a risk register. And what came out of this risk assessment was some mitigatory control. And what we did was that, as I said, that, it's not just a risk assessment. What we created for this rail metro was the LLD, preliminary design document, and the detailed design document. All the controls, the derived requirement that came out of these risk assessment, preliminary risk assessment, were taken into as a design, as a, things to consider into the preliminary design document as well as detailed design document. And we make sure that these additional controls, which can be the technical controls, administrative controls, procedural controls that came out of these risk assessment are part of the detailed design documentation and the detailed design process. They are being followed in the actual journey.
Oh, we have a follow-up.
So are you saying that the details which were submitted was actually being implemented?
Actually being implemented, okay. Yes.
It sounds like from your tone it's quite rare.
Yeah. This was real difficult, but I think the biggest win for us here was this was a greenfield project. So they are starting from scratch.
Thank you. Any other questions in the room? Probably got time for one more. Oh, okay.
Neha, thanks for a great presentation. So the comment that you made about it's not if, it's when, and having that conversation, how do you have that conversation without fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and the client having an allergic reaction to the example that you gave, like post-breach, giving advice is really easy because the checkbook's wide open,
yeah.
And it's sort of like Dracula in charge of the blood bank. How do you take the subjectivity and conflict out of it, and without smacking them over the head with fear?
Yeah, that's again a great question here, Scott. And this is part of my, I would say, most of the times when I sit with the client, it is not something that it's about sharing awareness. It's about telling what's going on. I think it was a month back there was an attack on Polish Railway. Some of you might be aware. And this is, as part of my daily regime when I speak with our customers. And this is something that often comes from their side, that, okay, do you think that we are in a good shape, we are in a position? How much do you feel basis, your understanding of our network? See, I can give you 100 marks basis, just to give you a confidence. But will that help you? No. What's going to help you is a real assessment. I'm not telling you to spend 1 million or 2 million to buy a jazzy product. I'm telling you, go for a security assessment, which is based on industry-based standards, industry-based recommendation. Combine it with some regulatory standards that your industry follow, and watch out for the result, that where do you lie? And I think this is something that flies with them, because it is very clear to them whether they have to pay now or pay later.